The invisible barrier, holding you back in life. There is something in your life that you cannot see, but it has been shaping your decisions for longer than you realize. It doesn't shout, it doesn't force you, it doesn't even feel like an obstacle at first. It feels like a thought, a hesitation, a quiet feeling that something is off, even when everything around you looks like it should be working. You wake up with plans, with intentions, with the desire to move forward. But somewhere between the intention and the action, something shifts. Your energy drops. Your clarity fades. Your confidence weakens in a way you can't fully explain. And over time, this begins to create a pattern. You start strong, but don't finish. You see opportunities, but don't step into them. You feel capable, but act like you're not. And the most confusing part is this. You know you have more inside you. You can feel it. There are moments, even brief ones, where you see a different version of yourself. A version that is clear, decisive, at peace, aligned. But just as quickly as it appears, it feels like it slips away. Like something pulls you back to the same place you've always been. This is where frustration begins to grow. Not because you're not trying, but because your effort doesn't seem to match your results. So you start searching for answers. You try to fix your habits. You try to organize your life. You try to be more disciplined. You try to think more positively. You even pray, asking God to help you move forward. But despite all of that, something remains unchanged. And slowly, a deeper question forms inside you. Why do I keep returning to the same place? This is where many people begin to turn against themselves. They assume they are the problem. They begin to believe they are inconsistent, weak, distracted, or simply not capable of sustaining growth. And without realizing it, they start building an identity around that conclusion. But what if that conclusion is not true? What if what you've been calling your limitation is actually something influencing you from a place you haven't been taught to look? The Bible speaks directly to this, not in a distant or abstract way, but in a way that exposes something deeply personal. In Segunda Carta aos Coríntios capítulo 10 versículo 4, it says that the weapons we fight with are not physical, but have divine power to demolish strongholds, and that these strongholds are arguments and thoughts that rise against the truth. This is not just about theology. This is about how your internal world is structured. Because what this reveals is that there are thought patterns, deeply rooted, repeated, reinforced, that begin to act like invisible structures inside your mind. Structures that don't just influence how you think, but how you interpret everything. They shape how you see yourself. They shape how you see opportunities. They shape how you respond to challenges. And because they are internal, they feel natural. You don't question them. You don't analyze them. You simply live through them. That's why this barrier is so difficult to identify. It doesn't feel like something external that you can fight. It feels like part of you. But here's the truth that changes everything. Not everything that feels like you is actually you. Some things were built in you, formed through experiences, through repeated thoughts, through moments where you had to make sense of pain, disappointment, fear, or uncertainty. And those interpretations stayed. They became the lens through which you now see your life. This is why you can have faith and still feel blocked, why you can pray and still feel resistance, why you can know truth and still struggle to live it. Because there is something invisible, quietly influencing everything. And once you begin to see it clearly, you realize that you were never lacking potential. You were navigating life through something that was never meant to define you. What you've been trying to fix on the outside may actually be rooted in something much deeper on the inside. Because when you look closely at your daily life, the issue is not that you don't know what to do. In many areas you already know. You know the decisions you should make. You know the habits that would help you. You know the direction that feels right. And yet there is a gap, a space between knowing and doing. And inside that space, something is happening. It's subtle. It happens quickly. Most of the time, you don't even notice it forming. but it is there shaping your response before you even act. A thought appears. This might not work. Another one follows. What if you fail again? Then something deeper settles in. Maybe this is just not for you. You don't stop and analyze it. You don't question where it came from. You simply feel its weight and adjust your behavior accordingly. This is how the invisible barrier operates, not by stopping you physically, but by influencing the meaning you give to every situation. Two people can stand in the exact same moment, with the same opportunity in front of them, and walk away with completely different outcomes. One moves forward, the other hesitates. The difference is not capability, it is interpretation. And interpretation is shaped by what has been built inside your mind over time. Think about how many conclusions you've formed without realizing it. Moments where something didn't go as expected, and your mind created a reason. Moments where someone's words affected you, and you internalized them. Moments where you felt pain, rejection, or confusion, and you needed to make sense of it quickly. Your mind did what it was designed to do. It created meaning. But the meanings you create in moments of vulnerability are not always accurate. They are often protective. They try to keep you safe from feeling the same pain again. So they become cautious, restrictive, limiting. If this hurt before, avoid it. If this failed once, don't risk it again. If this made you feel small, don't step into it. At first it seems helpful, but over time, it becomes a silent limitation. Because what started as protection turns into restriction. And eventually, you are no longer responding to life as it is. You are responding to life based on what you believe it will be. This is why patterns repeat. Not because your life is designed to stay the same, but because your internal interpretation keeps recreating the same response. You don't need the same exact situation to happen again. All it takes is something similar, and your mind fills in the rest. It assumes, it predicts, it reacts, and you find yourself pulling back, delaying, avoiding, or overthinking. Not because you consciously chose to, but because something inside you already decided what this moment means. This is where many people get trapped. They try to change their actions without addressing the interpretation behind them. They force discipline, but ignore the internal resistance. They push for motivation, but don't question the thoughts draining it. They try to move forward, but are still seeing everything through the same lens. And because of that, the results don't sustain. Because you can't consistently act against what you deeply believe. This is why the struggle feels so personal, because it is happening inside you. But what makes it even more powerful is this: what was built can be rebuilt. What was learned can be unlearned. What feels automatic can be questioned. And the moment you begin to observe your thoughts, instead of immediately agreeing with them, you step into a different level of awareness. You begin to separate who you are from what you have been thinking. And in that separation, something starts to open. There is a reason why these internal patterns feel so convincing, and it goes beyond habit or personality. It is because they are structured, not randomly, not occasionally, but consistently reinforced over time until they form something the Bible calls strongholds. In Segunda Carta aos Coríntios capítulo 10 versículos 4 a 5, it does not describe strongholds as external enemies. It defines them as arguments and thoughts that rise against the truth. This means you are not just dealing with isolated thoughts, you are dealing with systems of thought. A stronghold is not a single idea that appears once and disappears. It is a network of beliefs connected to each other, supporting each other, reinforcing each other until they create a stable internal structure. And that structure begins to act like a filter. Everything you experience passes through it. When something good happens, the structure finds a way to question it. When an opportunity appears, the structure finds a way to doubt it. When you feel inspired, the structure finds a way to weaken it. Not because you want to sabotage yourself, but because the structure is designed to stay consistent. It protects what it believes is true, even if that truth is limiting you. This is why change can feel so difficult. Because you are not just challenging a thought, you are challenging an entire internal system that has been operating for years. And systems don't collapse easily. They resist, they push back, they try to maintain control by sending familiar thoughts, familiar feelings, familiar doubts, not as an attack you can clearly see, but as something that feels normal. That's what makes it powerful. It uses your own voice. It sounds like your reasoning. It feels like your logic, so you don't question it. You agree with it. And once you agree with it, it shapes your next action. This is why the Bible doesn't say to ignore these thoughts. It says to take them captive. Not because every thought is wrong, but because not every thought is aligned with truth. This introduces a responsibility that many people have never practiced. To evaluate what is happening inside them. To pause and ask, is this thought actually true, or is it just familiar? Because familiarity can feel like truth, even when it isn't. And this is where something begins to shift. When you stop accepting every thought automatically, you interrupt the system. You create space. Space between the thought and your response. And in that space, something new becomes possible. You can choose differently. You can respond based on truth, not just on what you've always felt. This is how strongholds begin to weaken. Not by force, not by pressure, but by awareness and alignment. And once you understand that what you've been experiencing is structured, you also begin to understand something else. It is not permanent. So what exactly is this invisible barrier when you bring it down to its core? It is not just a thought. It is not just a feeling. It is an identity you agreed with without realizing it. At some point in your life, something happened that required you to interpret it quickly. Maybe you tried and failed in a moment that mattered to you. Maybe someone spoke words that stayed longer than they should have. Maybe you felt overlooked, rejected, or compared in a way that made you question your value. And in that moment, your mind didn't just register what happened. It created a conclusion. Not about the situation, but about you. I'm not good at this. I'm always behind. I'm not the kind of person who succeeds. I'm not enough. These conclusions didn't feel like beliefs. They felt like clarity. Because when you are in a moment of emotion, your mind is not trying to be accurate. It is trying to make sense of what you are feeling as quickly as possible. And whatever explanation it finds, it keeps. That's how identity begins to form, not through truth, but through repetition. The same thought appearing again and again, until it no longer feels like something you think. It feels like something you are. And once something becomes part of your identity, it no longer needs to convince you. You will defend it, even if it is limiting you. This is why you can want change, and still resist it at the same time. Because change is not just about doing something new. It is about becoming someone different than the version of you that your mind has been protecting. And that creates tension. On one side, there is a desire to grow. On the other side, there is an identity trying to stay consistent. And most of the time, consistency wins. Not because it is right, but because it is familiar. So even when you step forward, there is something inside you trying to pull you back. Not aggressively, but subtly. You begin to overthink. You delay decisions. You question opportunities. You feel uncertain without a clear reason. And without noticing, you return to what matches your internal identity. This is how the barrier maintains itself. It doesn't block you from the outside. It guides you from the inside. And here is the truth that changes everything. You do not act according to your potential. You act according to who you believe you are. If your internal identity says you are limited, you will unconsciously create choices that confirm that belief. Not intentionally, but consistently. This is why effort alone is not enough. You can push yourself, discipline yourself, even motivate yourself. But if the identity underneath remains unchanged, your actions will always return to the same level, because your mind is trying to stay aligned with what it believes is true about you. This is why transformation in the Bible always begins with identity, not behavior, not performance. Identity. Because once identity shifts, behavior follows naturally. And this is where many people have been fighting the wrong battle. They've been trying to change what they do, without addressing who they believe they are. But the moment identity is questioned, the barrier begins to lose its foundation. Because it was never built on truth, it was built on agreement. And what was agreed with can be reconsidered. This is where the Word of God stops being something you read and becomes something that reveals you. Because when the Bible speaks about transformation, it is not offering motivation. It is exposing truth that confronts the very foundation of how you see yourself. In Carta aos Romanos, capítulo 12, versículo 2, it says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Look carefully at what is being said. It does not say, change your circumstances. It does not say, force new behaviors. It says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This means the life you are living right now is deeply connected to the way your mind has been shaped, the patterns you follow, the limits you accept, the expectations you carry. All of these are reflections of an internal structure, and transformation begins when that structure is no longer left untouched. But here is something deeper that many overlook. Renewing the mind is not just about thinking differently. It is about aligning with a truth that already exists, whether you feel it or not. Because God's truth about you was never created by your experiences. It was established before them. While your experiences formed conclusions, God's Word reveals identity. While your past tried to define your limits, God's truth speaks about your purpose. While your mind says, this is who you became, God says, this is who you are. And this creates tension, because you can hear truth and still feel the old identity pulling you back. You can read something that is clearly aligned with God's Word, and yet, inside, something resists agreeing with it. That resistance is not weakness. It is exposure. It reveals where your current identity is still rooted in old conclusions. This is why renewing the mind is not a passive process. It is intentional. It is a decision you make repeatedly, especially in moments where your thoughts and God's truth don't align. When a thought says, you are not enough, and truth says you were created with purpose, you are faced with a choice. Which one will you agree with? When fear says, stay where it's safe, and truth calls you forward, you are faced with a decision. Which one will guide your action? This is where transformation becomes real, not in emotional moments alone, but in daily alignment. You begin to notice your thoughts more clearly. You begin to question what you used to accept automatically. You begin to bring your internal dialogue into the light of truth, and something starts to happen. The same thought that once felt dominant now feels questionable. The same belief that once felt solid now feels unstable. The same identity that once felt fixed now begins to loosen. This is how renewal works, not by erasing everything at once, but by replacing consistently. Old belief confronted, truth introduced, new alignment chosen, and over time, repetition begins to shift direction. What once reinforced limitation now begins to reinforce truth. And slowly your internal world starts to reorganize itself. Your thoughts become clearer. Your reactions become more intentional. Your decisions become more aligned. This is not about pretending something is true. It is about recognizing what has always been true and choosing to live from it. And as that happens, something becomes undeniable. The barrier that once felt so strong was only sustained by what you continued to believe. There is a moment in this process where something inside you becomes impossible to ignore. Not because everything is resolved, but because you can no longer pretend you don't see what is happening within you. You begin to recognize patterns with a clarity you never had before. You notice how certain thoughts arrive at specific moments. You see how certain feelings try to guide your decisions. You observe how quickly your mind tries to return to what is familiar, even when you know it no longer serves you. And with that awareness comes a deeper realization. Some of the choices you thought were yours were actually influenced by something you never questioned. You start looking back, not to blame yourself, but to understand. Moments where you stepped back when you could have moved forward. Moments where you stayed silent when you felt something inside you wanted to speak. Moments where you accepted less, not because it was all you deserved, but because it matched what you believed about yourself. And this can bring a weight. Not a destructive weight, but a revealing one. A weight that comes from seeing clearly. Because clarity has a cost. It removes the comfort of ignorance. You can no longer say, "I don't know why this keeps happening." Now you see the connection. You see how a thought led to a feeling, how a feeling shaped a decision, how a decision created a pattern, and how that pattern repeated until it felt like your reality. This is where many people feel a mixture of emotions. Regret for what could have been different, relief for finally understanding, discomfort for realizing how long it has been happening. But this is not where you collapse. This is where you gain authority. In Evangelio de Juan capítulo 8 versículo 32 it says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Notice something important. Freedom is not connected to time. It is connected to truth. The moment truth is recognized, something begins to break. Not everything at once, but enough to change your direction. Because what you can now see, you no longer have to follow blindly. This is the difference between being controlled and becoming aware. Before, the thought would come and you would act. Now, the thought comes and you observe. Before, the feeling would rise and you would follow. Now the feeling rises and you question. Before, the pattern would repeat automatically. Now, the pattern appears and you interrupt it. This is where your role becomes active in a new way. You are no longer just experiencing your life, you are engaging with it consciously. You begin to ask different questions. Where is this thought coming from? Is this aligned with truth or just with what I've always believed? Am I responding to reality or to a pattern? And these questions create space. Space where you are no longer reacting instantly. Space where choice becomes possible. And within that space, something begins to shift. You start to feel less controlled by what used to dominate you. You begin to notice moments where you respond differently. You experience small changes that carry real weight. Because transformation is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. It is the moment you don't withdraw like before. It is the moment you move forward even with uncertainty. It is the moment you don't agree with the thought that once defined you. And these moments begin to accumulate, until one day you realize something has changed, not just in what you do, but in how you see. And when your perception changes, your direction follows. Freedom begins to take shape when you stop trying to overpower what is happening inside you, and start aligning with what is true. Because for a long time, you may have tried to fight your thoughts with force. You tried to silence them, ignore them, push through them. And for a moment it may have worked, but the same thoughts returned. The same resistance showed up again. The same internal tension remained. Not because you lacked strength, but because force does not dismantle what was built through agreement. This is why the Bible speaks in a different direction. In Carta aos Efesios capítulo 4 versículos 22 a 24, it says to put off the old self, be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, created according to God. This is not about behavior modification. It is about alignment. Putting off the old self is not rejecting your past. It is refusing to keep agreeing with the identity that was shaped by it. Being renewed in your mind is not trying to think positively. It is allowing truth to reshape how you interpret everything. Putting on the new self is not pretending to be someone else. It is stepping into what has always been established by God, even if it still feels unfamiliar. And this is where something changes in your approach. You stop trying to win against your thoughts and start choosing which ones you will agree with. Because not every thought deserves your agreement. Some thoughts are echoes of past experiences. Some are shaped by fear trying to protect you. Some are simply patterns repeating themselves. And when you begin to see this, you stop giving every thought the same authority. You begin to pause. When doubt appears, you don't immediately follow it. When fear rises, you don't immediately obey it. When insecurity speaks, you don't immediately accept it. You create a moment of awareness. And in that moment, you ask a different question. Is this aligned with truth? That question alone begins to shift everything, because it interrupts the automatic cycle. It creates a gap between what you feel and how you respond. And in that gap, you are no longer controlled. You are choosing. This is how alignment becomes practical. You don't wait until you feel confident to act. You act based on what is true, even when confidence is still forming. You don't wait for fear to disappear. You recognize it and move without giving it control. You don't wait until everything feels certain. You move with clarity, even if the feeling hasn't caught up yet. And as you continue doing this, something begins to reorganize inside you. Thoughts that once dominated lose intensity. Patterns that once repeated begin to weaken. Reactions that once felt automatic become intentional. Not because you forced change, but because you changed what you agreed with. This is where your internal world begins to stabilize. You are no longer being pulled in different directions by every thought or feeling. You are grounded, not in emotion, but in truth. And from that place, your actions begin to reflect something new. You become more decisive, more consistent, more aligned with the direction you once hesitated to take. This is not a temporary shift. It is a new way of living. A life where you are no longer driven by what feels familiar, but by what is aligned. And as this continues, something becomes clear. The barrier never needed to be forced open. It only needed to lose your agreement. This is where everything becomes real. Not in theory, but in the middle of your everyday life. Because the true test of what is happening inside you is not in a quiet moment of reflection. It is in the moments where life demands a response from you. It's when you wake up and the same thoughts try to greet you before anything else. It's when you face a decision and feel that familiar hesitation rising. It's when something challenges you, and your first instinct is to step back instead of stepping forward. Nothing about these moments looks extraordinary, but everything about them is decisive, because this is where patterns either continue or begin to break. Before, these moments passed quickly. A thought came. You agreed. A feeling rose. You followed. A reaction happened, and the pattern repeated. Now something is different. Now you notice. You catch the thought before it fully settles. You feel the hesitation, but you don't immediately move with it. You recognize the pattern, and you pause. And that pause changes everything. Because in that brief moment, you are no longer inside the pattern. You are observing it. And observation creates choice. When you wake up and your mind says, "Today will be the same," you don't just accept it as a prediction. You recognize it as a pattern trying to repeat itself. And instead of letting it define your day, you decide what direction you will take. When you are about to step into something new and feel resistance, you don't immediately interpret it as a sign to stop. You ask yourself if this is wisdom, or if it is fear trying to keep you in what is familiar. When you feel inadequate, you don't rush to fix the feeling. You return to truth. You remind yourself of what God has established, even if your emotions are still catching up. This is how change becomes visible, not in dramatic shifts, but in consistent, intentional responses. You begin to move differently in the same situations that once held you back. You take the step you used to avoid. You speak when you would have stayed silent. You act when you would have delayed. And these small shifts begin to accumulate. What once felt like a fixed reality starts to loosen. The same environment, but a different response. The same challenge, but a different posture. The same thought, but a different outcome. This is how your life begins to change from the inside out. Because circumstances don't always change immediately, but your interaction with them does. And that interaction determines your direction. Over time, you begin to notice something powerful. Situations that used to drain you no longer carry the same weight. Thoughts that used to control you no longer decide your actions. Patterns that used to repeat begin to break naturally, not because they disappeared, but because you no longer respond in the same way. And this is where your confidence begins to grow, not as a feeling you wait for, but as something you build through repeated alignment. You begin to trust your decisions more. You begin to recognize your own growth. You begin to see that you are no longer the same person who used to stay stuck. And this realization changes how you move, because now you are not trying to escape a barrier. You are living beyond it. There is a point in this journey where everything inside you becomes quieter, not because life stopped being challenging, but because you are no longer reacting to everything the same way. Before, your mind was crowded. Every thought demanded attention. Every feeling tried to lead. Every situation carried weight that followed you throughout the day. And without noticing, you were constantly responding, constantly adjusting, constantly carrying more than you needed to. But now, something is different. You begin to realize that not everything that enters your mind deserves to stay there. You begin to recognize that you are not obligated to agree with every thought, to follow every emotion, or to carry every interpretation. And in that realization, something opens inside you. Space. A space where you are no longer overwhelmed by what is happening within you. A space where you can observe without immediately reacting. A space where you can choose instead of being pulled. This is where your relationship with God becomes something real and present, not distant or abstract. Because God does not speak through confusion. He speaks through clarity. And clarity is something you can now recognize. In Salmos capítulo 139, versículos 23-24, there is a prayer that shifts everything internally. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me, and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any harmful way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. This is not a prayer of performance. It is a prayer of exposure. You are no longer trying to control everything on your own. You are inviting God into the places you could not see clearly before. And this changes how you experience your inner world. Because what once operated in the dark is now being brought into the light. You begin to notice patterns with a different sensitivity. You begin to feel when something is not aligned. You begin to recognize the difference between what is true and what is just familiar. And as this awareness deepens, you start to sense direction, not as something loud or forced, but as something steady. A quiet clarity guiding your next step. A peace that does not depend on everything being resolved. A confidence that does not come from circumstances but from alignment. This is where strength begins to feel different. It is no longer about pushing harder. It is about walking with awareness. It is about responding with intention. It is about allowing truth to guide you, even when emotions are still catching up. And in this place, something that once felt distant begins to feel accessible. You no longer feel disconnected from your own direction. You no longer feel lost inside your own thoughts. You no longer feel like something unseen is controlling your life. Because now, what was unseen has been exposed. And once something is exposed, it loses its ability to operate the same way. You are no longer navigating blindly. You are walking with clarity. And that changes everything about how you move forward. What once felt like an invisible wall now reveals itself as something that was never meant to stay. Not because it disappeared on its own, but because you stopped giving it the agreement it depended on. And this is where everything comes together in a way that changes how you see your life from this point forward. Because for a long time, you may have believed that something outside of you was holding you back. That there was a limitation you couldn't explain, a force you couldn't overcome, a barrier you had to somehow break through. But now you see something different. You see that what once felt immovable was actually sustained. Sustained by repetition, sustained by interpretation, sustained by agreement. And the moment agreement shifts, structure begins to collapse. Not dramatically, not all at once, but undeniably. You begin to notice that the same thoughts that once defined your limits no longer feel absolute. The same situations that once stopped you no longer control your response. The same internal resistance that once felt strong now feels exposed. Because what gave it strength was never its power. It was your acceptance. And now, something inside you has changed direction. You are no longer automatically agreeing with what limits you. You are no longer interpreting every challenge as a signal to stop. You are no longer defining yourself by what you felt in your weakest moments. You are choosing alignment, and that choice begins to shape everything else. Because when your internal agreement changes, your external behavior follows naturally. You start stepping into opportunities you once avoided. You begin making decisions with clarity instead of hesitation. You respond to pressure with awareness instead of reaction. Not because everything became easier, but because you became clearer. And clarity changes how you move. You no longer wait to feel ready. You no longer depend on perfect conditions. You no longer look for certainty before taking a step. You move from truth, not from fear. And as you continue walking this way, something becomes undeniable. Your life is no longer being shaped by what you believed in the past. It is being shaped by what you are choosing now. This is what real transformation looks like. Not a sudden escape from difficulty, but a steady shift in how you engage with everything. You are not trying to become someone else. You are removing what was never truly you, the false conclusions, the limiting interpretations, the identity that was built in moments that were never meant to define your future. And what remains is clarity. Clarity about who you are. Clarity about how you think. Clarity about how you move forward. And from that clarity, something powerful happens. You stop living as someone trying to break through a barrier, and you start living as someone who is no longer contained by it. Because what was invisible before then was never stronger than your ability to see it, question it, and stop agreeing with it. And now that you see it, it no longer decides your direction.